Well, guys, we're just past 1 o'clock, so I think we might get started. We've got 10 people come on so far. That's all right. We are recording as well, so if people want to, have come in late and have missed anything, they can always refer back to that. So I just want to start this meeting by acknowledging that wherever we're zooming in from, that we are on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. And I want to also acknowledge that I'm on Gumbaynggirr country here in Coffs Harbour, and I want to acknowledge all elders past, present and emerging. This afternoon we have Dr. Scott Avery from the Western Sydney University, who's also the FPDN research partner, and some of you may be familiar with his work. His report, Culture is Inclusion. And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Scott. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, and hello. Good year, you, which has hello and welcome. I'm zooming in from Dharawal country, which is down the southern parts of Sydney, and it goes all the way right down to sort of Nowra. I'm Warramai, which is, we're river people. So if you're going on the river, you cross the Karoo River and you get to the Manning River, driving from Sydney to Brisbane, that's where Warramai country is. And I would just like to add my personal acknowledgement to the traditional owners and elders on the lands on which you all are today, where I am here. Their spirits, our ancestors are watching over us, and hopefully watching over me, so I don't make too many mistakes. But and I'm very grateful to my my mob, the First People Disability Network, and my mob where I am now, Western Sydney University. A few students, staff, and alumni, I believe, will be dialing in to sometime during the webinar. So hello. I probably should point out, as I said, I'm an Aboriginal man myself, Warramai. Probably should point out I'm profoundly deaf as well. So that's the connection I have. So you can't see these, but I have a cochlear implant and a hearing aid here. So, and that's a connection I have with the First People's Disability Network, where I spent probably 4 or 5 years doing some community-based, very grounded research that I did, and just went out to talk with Aboriginal people with disability. And our research question was, look, just tell us your story. And the reason we wanted to do that was the voices of Aboriginal people with disability often are sidelined in developing systems and policies and programs. And it's kind of like, we haven't heard about that story. So we wanted to get that story out. So what came from that was a book that Tori mentioned. It's called Culture is Inclusion. I'll just put that up there. So it's very much a resource that we had in mind for our community. If you contact FPDN, they have copies of that. And from that, and what I wanted to focus on today was, what does good health mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability? And it will touch on some of the barriers that people have in accessing good health, some of the cultural dimensions of health as well. And there's a bit of a cultural clash there that we'll talk through. So this is focusing on that. So it draws a lot from in the book. It touches on the book. The book is more than that. He talks about education and justice, but I'll focus more about health today. And I want to connect it to, what does disability, what does it mean for many people watching today who are disability in the disability sector, either advocates, activists, or service providers? Why are we talking about health in this space? I want to bring that together. And the reason it is very important, because at the moment there's a Royal Commission into the violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disability. And a lot of what we're talking about is some of the health inequalities have been presented. They've been placed right in front of the Royal Commission. So it's a very contemporary and serious issue of concern. The Royal Commission focuses broadly on disability and the exploitation and neglect is very much a topic when you're talking about health. But once if you're an Aboriginal person and you have disability, it's like the volume switch turns right up. So we'll be talking a lot around the barriers that people face. So just to start though, just to give a sort of grounding on what good health means to Aboriginal people generally, but it certainly resonates with people with disability, is Aboriginal people have this worldview, and it's a value system that they have. And health is more than just my body feels healthy, the physical aspect of being healthy. It brings into the health of the spirit, the health of your community, so sense of your connectedness. So if your spirit is strong and your connections with your community is strong, you feel healthy. And often that can override some of the physical ill health you might feel. So and it's very much a value system that resonates with a culture of inclusion, which is how we wrote about in the book. And this culture that is inclusive of people with disability. And it's kind of not, it's not very much, there's a saying that we say there's no word for disability, in that our culture and our value system brings people with disability. So it's not that deficit culture that a lot of the disability system services are provided for. So someone like me, some might, local language, they say, oh, you're a bit din bin, which actually means dead air. And it's not used in a pejorative way. It's just a sort of saying, look, just be aware that this person has a hearing impairment and make accommodations, but you're included in your community. And that has a very positive, affirming effect for the health of people. So again, it's like if my spirit is strong, my connections are strong, I have a positive and affirmative view about my health. Now, the dilemma that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people face is that the health and disability systems aren't set up that way. So they're not set up in a way that aligns with cultural values. They do rely on, finding out, we need to find out what's wrong with you, that deficit concept, why are you sick? So that deficit base around health. And it's a bit different or antithetical to how many Aboriginal people see their health from a cultural standpoint, which is a bit more comprehensive and holistic. So when it comes down to the access issues, and that's vitally important, I don't want to run the health system down, because we need the health system to provide vital system. So what I'm really wanting to talk about is to alert people to some of the cultural and social issues to make it a bit more responsive, because at the moment the health and inequality that Aboriginal face is quite acute and quite extreme. So, and there are a number of barriers that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people face in accessing good healthcare, and they can be cultural and they can be social, or a combination of both. I'm going to focus on three kind of categories that have come up in my research and have been spoken about. And the first issue that I want to talk about is how it relates to undiagnosed or unreported health conditions. So again, this could be cultural or could be social. So often when we would talk to people, if there's a cultural inclusion that doesn't really place an emphasis on the disability side, we might say, do you have a disability? And they go, oh, no, then we get around. Or they might say, do you suffer from hearing loss? And they go, oh, no, I don't suffer from it. They might have it, but they don't suffer from it. So it's very different culturally to how often the Western healthcare system, that model of healthcare, tries to detect health conditions. Now, the diagnosis is very important. Having a health diagnosis or a disability diagnosis is very important. So again, this is why I don't want to run it down, because that's a trigger to accessing healthcare supports, and often they're very, very much needed. But in particularly, you see this particularly in remote communities that don't have some of the specialist healthcare services, you'll find that many people struggle to get an accurate diagnosis for a health condition or even their disability. So I'm just going to touch on some work I'm doing now with the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And this comes from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Survey. And what we did in the health survey is we did a couple of things. The first thing we did, and this is in relation to hearing impairment, more questions, but I'll focus on hearing impairment. is what we did in the hearing impairment. First, we asked people, and he said, do you have a hearing impairment? And so people ticked a box or not. So they were basically self-reported. What followed then was a hearing test. It's the first time this has ever been done, because what we were able to do with that was then we were able to say, well, who said they had a hearing impairment and was diagnosed, but who did not have one? And the first big thing that the data showing us is that 43% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a hearing impairment. So that's quite an astronomical number. So they were actually found, they were measured to have a hearing impairment, 43%. And then we started to looking at, well, how much of that was disclosed beforehand? And we looked at the age of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander children aged between 7 and 14. So really at the younger age. And for every one child that said they had a hearing impairment and was found to have a hearing impairment through the measurement, there were 9 that were found to having a hearing impairment that didn't know in the first place. So for every 10 children, 9 who have a hearing impairment, 9 have an undiagnosed or unreported hearing impairment. That number is just astronomical. Now, we don't know why, and it could be a factor of many things. It could be the access to the diagnosis in many remote communities, so they're just not getting hearing tests. That could be one reason. It could be the cost of hearing technology. So people are having a hearing impairment is actually quite expensive. There's quite sophisticated technology involved. People might be worried about the cost of that, so they're not reaching out for help. Or it might be stigma. So people they might be feared that they might get bullied or picked on at school, or their teacher might pick on them at school because they have a hearing impairment. We don't know what it is, and we need to find out why, because I said if 90% of Aboriginal children have a hearing impairment, they don't know. That is just an astronomical number, because what that happens is that flows into their level of educational attainment, then their employment. So if you have a hearing impairment compared to an Aboriginal who doesn't, you're attaining educational standards at half the rate of Aboriginal children without a hearing impairment. So if you have a hearing impairment, say reaching year 10 or reaching year 12 or going on to university, that happens at half the rate if you have a hearing impairment compared to those who don't. And it's the same outcome with employment. So we've got this kind of hidden inequality that only the data's just only starting to scope now. But it does tell about, like when you're seeing people, not to presume that it's not enough just to presume what they're telling you. There might be some things that are undiagnosed or undetected, which is making a serious impact on their quality of life. So one of the things I spoke about was stigmas, and I think in the healthcare system that is incredibly significant and underappreciated factor in accessing the quality of healthcare. So what I'm talking about stigmas is people fear they might be discriminated against or something bad might happen to them. And some examples, if I think about, for example, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So there's a lot of work going on now around the clinical diagnostic techniques that is used to identify fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. But if the mother is feeling like they might be blamed, or she might be worried about what happened to the child, the child might be ostracized, there's a barrier in them coming forward in the first place. So you can have the best diagnostic tool in the world, but if people feel that they might be discriminated against or isolated by coming forward and reaching out help, then people, that's something we really we don't think about that enough in accessing healthcare. It's a lot around, let's get the tool right, but we're not thinking around the social aspects of, well, is this accessible to people from a cultural and social perspective? And what happens is that, so another example I might give is an Aboriginal man that I met through my research, and he has a cognitive impairment. He actually lives not far from here in Western Sydney, and his story was that he said he's often presumed to be drunk by other people, and this is what we call like an intersectional kind of inequality. So you kind of get disability discrimination, which is ableism, which is how people see their disability in public and the negative attitudes around that. And if you add racism to that, it's kind of like, again, turning the volume switch and the quality of life that it has. So this Aboriginal man, like I said, the public prejudices and stereotypes around Aboriginal people and drinking, combined with his presentation, means that he's always being confronted. So when he goes to the shopping centres, the security guards will hassle him when he tries to catch a bus. So he's basically, life's been robbed from him, and it's all negative attitudes around this. So how do we change this? And part of this is why we talk about this, is to kind of get people, don't presume things. People are jumping to presumption. And that gets super serious and has quite significant effect when that comes into the healthcare system. And what happens is people with disability are presenting with conditions, quite serious health conditions, and that gets passed off is that they're drunk or they're faking it. And some of the research that came through, some of the people that spoke to me as part of the research were saying one Aboriginal man he's a tetraplegic, and he started dehydrating on a very, very hot day. And he had the nous to sort of go to a bottle where there would be water and ice and he could rehydrate himself, but his body started breaking down. But the ambulance, when they called the ambulance, he got passed off as being drunk. And it wasn't until sometime later, when someone actually started taking some really basic diagnostic tests and went, oh, it's not that. It's something more serious. And it was just that they didn't do some very fundamental basic tests. And you'll see this come up in critical incidents in the healthcare system quite often, where people aren't conducting very fundamental basic tests because they presume something that's not in existence, and so they're not discharging their duty of care. So that's where Stigmas comes in, and it can have quite significant effect. The third part, which is again is a contemporary issue, is the impact for people who are marginalised in society, so they're socially isolated, and how they are affected when there's rationing of healthcare. So what I mean by rationing of healthcare is you have a really, really busy hospital with a finite amount of resources, and rationing says who gets what care. And a lot of this is driving some of the anxiety around the ethical decision-making around the COVID-19 scenario. If hospitals get stretched, who gets care and who doesn't? And we're there's quite some disturbing practices or protocols that were put out internationally that basically people with disability were sort of saying, well, we will treat everyone else and then we'll get to people with disability. And they were quite disturbing. And there was an Aboriginal man I met as part of my research up in Northern Territory. Hello to all the Northern Territory people up there too. And we'd spent some time talking, and he'd actually waited for about an hour and a half to tell his story. And about 20 minutes into our discussion, our yarn, he lifted up his trouser leg, and I could see he had this pin in his knee. It was about that big. And I've got a health background. I'm going, well, that was really quite confronting. I thought, what's going on here? And we found out that he'd had a knee operation. He'd been in hospital for a couple of weeks. So it turned out to be it was a serious operation. And I could still see the scar and the pin in his knee. And I said, oh, so where are you staying? And he goes, I'm sleeping rough. And I've just gone, okay, so we're in Australia, an Australian healthcare system, and it discharges an elderly Aboriginal man after a major knee operation straight into homelessness. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about our concerns that there is rationing of the healthcare system and who are the winners and losers in that. And if you're isolated, the susceptibility that you will not get quality of care when resources are stretched really drives a lot of our anxiety and some of our fundamental health status. Isn't that great? So if you're a person with disability, your core health status, you are susceptible and vulnerable to that. So So that's something that's driving us. So, and I can imagine a lot of people who are disability service workers going, well, I'm a disability service worker, you know, what's this got to me? And I said, the thing with disability health, it's often a very, very fine split, particularly the further you get away from some of the metropolitan centres which have care, because what can happen is health conditions are not managed, preventable health conditions are not managed to a point that they become a disability. So you might have a situation where a person has quite chronic diabetes and it's in the health system. So it's not a disability, it's a long-term health condition. But what happens if that is not managed? It can lead to eye problems and potentially amputations of limbs and knees. So it's often a very blurry line about what is a disability and what is not. Another example is, you know, what we've become familiar with is people with, say, stage 4 renal failure. And, you know, I guess that's quite a debilitating health condition, but it's seen as a health condition. But there's so much around the capacity to get around. There's a disability component to that. If it's just a healthcare system, then the full comprehensive needs of that person, you know, in that very chronic situation, is missing. So, and I imagine you might be sitting there going, well, I'm a disability service person. I don't want to be giving diabetes advice. And I'm sort of not saying that. What I'm challenging you is not to presume that they are getting diabetes service advice from elsewhere, because what we are hearing from the Royal Commission in the testimony is that Aboriginal people with disability are particularly susceptible to neglect in their healthcare. So if some things are going wrong, the issue is that they're not being provided with healthcare in a timely way, and that's leading to quite serious acute. So my challenge is to the disability sector is, I think we need to start rethinking our duty of care in relation to things you might see of people who with disability and sort of undisclosed or unmanaged or untreated health conditions, which could turn into neglect and ultimately end up in the kind of cases you're hearing in the Royal Commission. So I think that's a challenge that I want to get to and why I'm talking a lot about health today. So just closing, you know, out this talk, you know, I spoke a lot around the clinical side of things, but I want to get to what good health is. And like I said, access to good medical and clinical care, that is very important. But the other thing I want to talk about is come back to that sense of belonging and connectedness. So in our research, cultures inclusion, we found that there was inequality. It wasn't just health inequality. There was inequality in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people getting jobs, getting a good education. There was inequality in accessing justice. So people with Aboriginal people with disability ending up in the justice system at astronomical rates compared to other groups. That's what I mean by inequality. There was one exception. And the one exception was Aboriginal people with disability participate in cultural and community events at the same rate as other Aboriginal people. So I remember us telling that there was no word for disability in Aboriginal language at the start, that cultural value. That finding is that line of sight back to our community connectedness, our Aboriginal culture of inclusion. And it's more than just saying we participate. So what I mean by participating is that they're involved in community events. They go to NAIDOC, they learn language, they speak with elders, quite layered community participation. It's not vague in any sense of the word. It's quite layered. And that pattern is right through. So Aboriginal people with disability are participating in our communities and our cultures. That's one part of the story. The second part, it actually has an affirmative or positive impact upon its health and well-being. So that's what we call like psychosocial dimensions to health. You might hear psychosocial disability, which is a negative. So cultural participation is a counter to that. And so even in our research, the process of just sitting down and talking to people, respecting them personally, giving them a chance, You know, people that we met had been exposed to quite serious traumas, in some cases quite serious exposures to violence, serious health issues. That community, that process of bringing them into community is actually part of their healing process. So that's how the healing comes through. So I think this is a bit of the frontier work, because we're still figuring out, you know, how it actually works, and more importantly, how it can actually be incorporated into disability and health programs. But it's a philosophy of healthcare, and it's a very different philosophy of healthcare to the medical model, which is about, well, let's find a diagnosis or a label to this. This is really about the positive impact of bringing people into community and the positive effect it has on its health. So that's kind of where I want to go to. And I think this work is kind of frontier. I said it's frontier. We're still figuring it out. But also understanding, you know, counteracting, you know, some of these things, you know, why are not people getting access to services? And it's not just because the clinical services there's more of a story to that. So uncovering this story. I think we need allies, and I know a lot of people who are dialing in and talking have an interest in this. So I think that's the second challenge around rethinking your duty care is how do I become a good ally in supporting this, and encouraging service systems like the NDIS to go, hey, you know, this is important to us. Don't put yourself in a box and say, look, it's disability. Same people who interact with the healthcare service. Don't just we shouldn't just be waiting for this to become to a serious issue. We need to address some of these issues now so we can get a bit more about, you know, the fairness and equity back in how Aboriginal people can access healthcare. So that's it for me. I just want to say Maramboo, which is thank you to you for listening. And I think there's an opportunity now to take questions via the chat room, if I'm right, Tori, is that right?
Yeah, mate, that's
So do people want to have any questions that they would like to ask?
yeah, we've got one question, Scotty, from an anonymous person. Do you think no inequality exists in Aboriginal people with disabilities participating in cultural events than in education, justice, jobs, etc., because at the foremost of these events is cultural safety?
So what I can answer is I looked at the population, so Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people as a group. So, had a look at that, and I found that as a group that there was inequality in participation, but it wasn't perfect. So there were some cases where Aboriginal people led community activities. So in that case, we're kind of leading the way, but it's not perfect. So there were some cases where I found that, and I found this particularly with people, some examples that I had with people who were deaf, so signing, weren't able to access some community meetings because there wasn't an access to Auslan. So it wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think what carried through is the value system was there. Our values of being inclusive were there. So it was practiced differently and not perfectly, but comparing to how the Western healthcare system is designed around a deficit model so a lot of language around what it's called a medical model is, we think you're broken, we can fix you. So I'm deaf, we can fix you by giving you a cochlear implant. So there's this notion of fixed. Now, we get the services, but there's a stigma attached to that kind of way. It's a simplistic way of thinking, but to illustrate the point. Social inclusion, social model of disability is around, okay, well, what's the environment you're in? So I'm deaf, I'm in a room that's got good acoustics and I do that. That's the social model. And that's really a message around, well, we can accommodate you. What the cultural model of inclusion is around, look, just come sit with us. You're our community, you're our family, come sit with us. You're kind of equal with us. We don't think you're broken. We don't need to fix you or accommodate you. We just want to include you. And it's really about the strength of the relationship, which is very important. Again, that relational model of health and services, that seems to carry through. But then I'm not saying it's perfect. And often I find there are on occasions where Aboriginal structures can mimic, if you like, Western structures for the sake of them being able to get change. And I think that's where some, there's just sort of a word of caution there that, that our values should take hold. Cool. I've got a few questions here, Tori, that are coming through on the chat, if you don't mind. So there's a question from Justine, who said, thanks, Scott. What ways can encourage the health systems to take this community inclusion approach forward? I think that we really kind of need to keep knocking on the door a bit of the healthcare system. Before I was an academic, I spent a lot of time in activism and policy land down in Canberra. And there was an avoidance of tackling this. It was almost like this is in the too hard basket. And a lot of that comes down to the design of the healthcare system and the policy. So healthcare policy, say, Close the Gap focuses on one part, which is the Aboriginal Indigenous side, and something like the Undiagnosed or the disability strategy focus on disability. So what we're talking is a bit of a nuanced approach, which brings these two together. And I think we just have to keep pushing through. And part of the reason we wanted to write books like this was to say, look, there's data out that is actually exposing or scoping this issue as a very serious critical issue. So we just kind of got to keep putting the argument, the data, and the research in front of them. I think the Disability Royal Commission will be quite significant in this, because very hard doing that from a community organisation. Almost you're outside the system, and what power and influence you can have within the system can often say, well, we don't need to talk to you, so we often get sidelined. So we need allies as a first, but I think the Disability Royal Commission will, they're shaking things up because they have the power to put the systems on notice. And I would like to think that the systems will respond in time. They'll actually take it out of the too hard basket. I think there needs to be a discussion, what do we really need to incorporate this? But I think it's like we need to start challenging some of their, in the health system, the language, I would say, challenging their clinical governance frameworks. We need to be teaching this in universities. So go you good thing, Western Sydney. This is, I think, what's going to be making a change. Tori, did you want me just to go through the questions?
Yeah, that'd be great if you don't mind, Scott.
So I've just gotten some of our work. We try to address some of the negative association around terminology such as psychosocial disability and not see as negative terminology. Is this approach not necessary in the right cultural model? Look, I think language is very, very important with stigma, the stigmatization of it all. And it's kind of like this kind of every kind of, it's unchallenged, it takes hold. And I'm very alert to some of the language. Some work I've been doing with another government agency is they used to use the word normal hearing or severe and worse. So it was very judgmental. It was actually seen as like hearing is bad or good. So, but it's actually taken a lot of time to challenge that because, as it turns out, all their data systems are defined that way. But we're kind of going, look, you're actually adding to the stigmatization, and now we're starting to show some of this thing. So I'm very alert to how some of the ableist language in particular can be framed in the negative. So even talking about hearing loss and hearing impairment, hearing loss is seen as deficit. That is an example. It's probably in a different category to the one where I said you know, do you have normal hearing or abnormal hearing? That kind of thing is kind of not that. But I think increasingly we'll be using language and those kind of things to challenge the way we see disability more generally in society. And I'm very alert to that. And I think every time you see that, it's an opportunity to have a discussion. I go to community as my barometer as whether I should get upset about things or not. So I always check in with the disability community. I have another question from Jamie, I believe. Any ideas how I can get to working with Aboriginal people, whether it is psychology or something else career-wise? Look, I think there are lots of opportunities. I know Western Sydney has a lot of very, very, very good courses in social work, if you want to look at that. Plug for the home team. And I certainly think that, but there are courses out there. And I think it's more than just doing a course. I would get to know the community organisations in the field that you're interested in and form an affiliation with them that is led by them. And that way you can work respectfully. So it's more than just being the smartest person in the room when you're working with Aboriginal people, because a lot of Aboriginal people leave the room if you act like that. So it's really around very much having good relationships and building a trust. So I think as you're looking at courses, there's social work courses, there's Aboriginal health courses, many universities and technical colleges offer those. You can do that. So pick something that gravitates to you. But I also recommend you know, getting involved in some community organisations. So there's a lot of community organisations that I'm not necessarily Aboriginal, but I work with Aboriginal people. So there's an organisation called ANTAR, ANTAR. You can look them up online and just get involved, and you can become an ally that way. And you can learn the relational part of Aboriginal people as well.
Scott, I just got a couple more questions coming through the Q&A.
Sure, mate.
Yeah, there's one asking, were there follow-up questions of Aboriginal people who had experiences where negative stigmas followed them, like the account of how people thought that the Aboriginal man was an alcoholic? Were they able to voice against these stereotypes, and was that part of your research?
Yeah, so so the stereotyping came up. Like I said, I just went out to people. I didn't say, have you been discriminated against? I just went out and said, look, tell me your story. And people were starting to tell me their stories. So I ended up formally interviewing. A lot of people told me things outside that setting, but because of the research program, these were people who, you know, there was a bit of robust process around capturing this as testimony. And so the Aboriginal people who told me their story it was a pattern. So it wasn't just one person, it was a pattern that happened over and over and over again. People were telling me different versions of this intersectional inequality where being an Aboriginal person connected with being a disability. And it wasn't just racism, it wasn't just ableism, the two had to come together. And that did follow them through the whole life. And then when we looked at some of the statistical data, because we had the stories, but we know that if we're trying to influence change, particularly with government, you need the numbers as well. So we went out and got the statistics, and the statistics supported what the people were telling us. And that was that Aboriginal people, the health outcomes and the social outcomes they got were inferior. There was a greater inequality across everything, whether it was getting a house, transport, health, every single indicator was, if you're an Aboriginal person with disability, your outcomes were not as high as other groups, even if you're Aboriginal without disability or a person with disability. So that carried through, and there's a thing called like, it's like over their life trajectory. And what happened was one part of their inequality carried over into the next part. So it started, you know, even in the situation that they're born. And so if, for example, if you're a young child and like the hearing issue that I had before, spoke of before, and that doesn't get picked up, that gets carried into their classroom. And so we call this phrase bad black kid syndrome, where basically children get stigmatized in the education system. And so I saw a government report which they buried this data. 1 in 3 Aboriginal children with disability incur a long-term suspension. So this massive, massive inequality just gets buried. And then so what happens is if they can't get their educational attainment on par with other people, it makes it harder for them, more difficult to get a job. So again, this pattern flowed all the way through, and it ultimately ends up in, you know, the rates at which Aboriginal people with disability end up in juvenile justice and in the prison system is just absolutely astronomical. So yes, the idea of it just follows them through their life. And I think what we're trying to do is the point I want to get across, the opposite point I want to get across there is, whilst that's thinking, oh my God, how do you address that? That notion of this life trajectory, helps you identify some pivot points where you can alter the life trajectory. So instead of suspending the child from the education system, do the basic tests. Do they have a hearing problem that's affecting, or a cognitive problem that's gone missed that's affecting their educational? Don't just default to the suspension. Provide an alternative pathway to that. So I think that's where the next step is the research has scoped this problem. We really need to take it into and work with service providers and policy people and going, what needs to be done to alter that life trajectory? Part of it's awareness raising, but again, we've got to get people to take it, policy makers and system decision makers, to take it out of the too hard basket. Over to you, mate. You got another one for me?
Yeah, thanks, Scotty. Yeah, we've got another one. Do you have any ideas about how we can use a different language instead of the Western deficit approach when talking to ATSI people with disabilities about accessing the NDIS?
That's a tricky one, because the whole system, disability itself is disability, and it's actually is almost inherently framed in a negative. So it's hard for us to get around because whole support systems that are designed to that. So if you have a diagnosis that diagnoses a disability, it triggers it. But I think what we need to do more work on is counteracting the stigma that is attached to that. So how can we create a positive language? And again, it's like challenging the stereotypes, and it's being alert to the casual ableism that we tend to do. And one of the questions come up around the use of language is really being conscious around language. So many times I hear on the news where people want to insult someone. They go, are you deaf or something? And you're not listening. I said, these are these little things that continually marginalize and reinforce. So it does start, we can all do things to change that. But again, to be advocates, to create a positive language and get this. The reason we called it cultural inclusion was, okay, we do need to navigate the medical and disability system, but this culture of inclusion moderates that, and we just need to build that up as well. So that's how I would be seeing to take it forward.
Thanks, Scott. We got another one. How can we facilitate a greater acceptance of culture and learnings from this that can be used across all sectors, as Indigenous culture has so much to offer everyone? What education, information and resources are available to refer people to?
I've often thought that this culture of inclusion, I think of the Uluru Statement when I talk about this, because the Uluru Statement from the heart, for people who don't know, it's a statement around the Aboriginal people and our leaders. It's a statement about our place in Australia, and it's in reference to the constitutional recognition and recognise the people. But there's a part in it that goes, it is a gift to our country. This is healing for our country. And I think of cultural inclusion, I think it's the same way, because, and I know that there are people in the disability community who go, we want that. this is not about disability. It's actually about inclusion and our sense of belonging in Australia, in the world, whether it's the education system. So it's a mindset shift. And I think this mindset shift, because it's reflective of a different value base, the more we can accommodate that, I think there'll be positive benefits, not just for Aboriginal people with disability, but for the disability community within Australia generally, because I think it does break down some of the barriers. It's all about inclusion, and you know, you see other examples like this with, you know, land management, Indigenous land management techniques. I think if our teaching systems, our education systems can be more open to Indigenous methodologies of learning, I'd like to see that happen in disability inclusion studies, and this will happen as it is happening in, say, land management, Indigenous health more broadly. So, yeah, that's where I'd like to see it go.
Yeah, thanks, Scotty. I don't think there is any more questions. Yeah, no, there doesn't seem to be any more coming through. So, yeah, no, thank you for taking the time today, Scott, just to, you know, share, you know, your, I guess, expertise in this field. And, you know, you know, I believe I first met you a couple of years ago, and I said to you, as a disability service practitioner at the time, I said, if we were playing footy, you were like, you know, Greg Inglis. And I still hold that true, you know, as a, you know, a person that's come from working on the front line to what I'm doing now as a community advocate, the work that you're doing. I think it's very important for you, you know, like this, you know, policies and even like the you know, semantics to change. So yeah, you know, like you're very highly valued in our community, mate. And I just want to just acknowledge that, you know, the fantastic work that you're doing. And I guess also now in your new role at the university, you're actually able to influence the minds of, you know, the future thought leaders that are coming through. So there will be a recording of this. Jamie, I've just noted your comment. This will be up on the website, FPDN, under the webinar page. We've also, actually, while I was talking, Scotty, we've got another question come through.
Yep.
We still have a bit of time. So,
sure.
Well, Kylie Roberts just wants to acknowledge much respect for Scott, and thank you for your time. We also have another one asking, Aboriginal people have been referred to by a lot of names. Today, acceptable terms are clear on how to respectfully refer to them. Are people with disabilities the same? Are there better ways to refer to them?
Yeah, and I think that comes down, it's interesting because disability is such an umbrella term that it gets used in different ways. And I think the secret, as Aboriginal people or Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, or whether it's First Peoples with disability, that there's different people use and prefer different terms. And I think it is just to respect how they like to identify themselves. So when I talk, I will often interchange, but here we are with the First Peoples Disability Network. They consciously chose that. So that's a language that we talk of. Other people identify with their nation. In the disability community, some people will say, they like to say, I'm a disabled person. So they're very strong and proud about the identity of people with disability. There are others who use the term people with disability. I think where we're at is to just respect personal choice and work within that and try not to assert them. So you'll know when you work with community how they like to identify themselves. And if you can sort of seamlessly fit within that language, then I think you'll go far. There is one thing that gets me is if you're using the word Indigenous as a proxy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, it is a proper noun, so it must be capitalised. So that's only my one thing that gets me on my hobby horse all the time. So hopefully that addresses you.
Yeah, they've said, thank you for the explanation. So on that note, Scott, once again, thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for attending. There will be a link to this recording on our website in the coming days. And be sure to register for our next webinar, where we're going to be covering the area of people with disability and housing. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye now. I'm
humbled, Tori. Thank you so much. And Greg Inglis is making a comeback tonight, mate. So
yeah, he is. I saw that. How good's that?
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again. Bye now.